Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 211, Hugo Brassey. Hugo Bulkley Brassey was born on the 5th of March 1910 in Berkeley Square, London, to Robert Bingham Brassey and Violet Edith Lowry Corrie. He was the youngest child of two who survived infancy. He had a sister, Moira Violet Brassey, who was born in 1906. His father, Robert Brassey, was a captain in World War I and was an MP fleetingly for Banbury, but when in Western Australia in 1936, he was reported as saying that he would not stand again in politics because he did not agree with paying MPs, as it meant unfitting people were elected to Parliament. He didn't agree with voting rights for women, and he felt strongly that voting should be restricted to property owners, as only they knew enough to vote sensibly. He owned large estates in Northamptonshire and Tipperary. The home in Northamptonshire, Cottesbrook Hall, was very grand. It was built in 1702 and Robert Brassey owned it from 1911 to 1937. It is regarded today as one of the best examples of Queen Anne architecture remaining in England. Hugo's mother died at the young age of 38 when Hugo was only 9. They had 5 children. The first child died a few days after birth, leaving Hugo as the only son. His father remarried in the year after Violet died to Lady Dorothy Grosvenor, so for 7 years Hugo had a stepmother who was an aristocrat. Robert divorced Dorothy in 1927 and then married Constance Britton. Hugo seems to have had much respect for his great-uncle, Lord Thomas Brassey, and his wife, Auntie Annie. Thomas Brassey was a past governor of Victoria. Hugo was educated at Eton, and it seems that most in the Brassey family were also educated at Eton. He often wore the old Otenian tie at social events and at the races. Many of his ancestors also went to Oxford University, but for some reason Hugo did not do so. He was at Sandhurst Royal Military College for a short while. His father, who was captain in the 17th Lancers in World War I, also trained there and had a military career, but Hugo did not choose that path. He stayed with Lord and Lady Gowrie in 1929 when Lord Gowrie, that is Sir Alexander Hall Ruthven, was the Governor-General of South Australia. Lord Gowrie went on to be Governor of New South Wales for a year and then Governor-General of Australia. Hugo had a job with him as an aide-de-camp, and that could have led to a successful career. However, it doesn't seem he was interested in that field of endeavour and preferred the freedom. Hugh was godson of Lady Gowrie. After Hugo attended agricultural college in South Australia for 6 months, he spent a year or two on sheep stations owned by the de Burgh Perce family at Beaudesert. One property was called Wyambin. It had a huge old mansion, and the other one was Tabragalba. The owners of the station, the Perce family, were connected with Hugo, as Baroness Sarah Perce was Hugo's great-grandmother on his mother's side. He was reported as being a fine horseman and a capable bull rider, and was popular and fitted in very well in the station and the nearby town. Hugo was having a grand adventure. On the 25th of November 1931 in the Adelaide News, Mr. Hugo Brassey, a nephew of Lady Hall Ruthven, will leave Adelaide on the Otranto tomorrow on his return to London. In 1933, Hugo is back in England and living at Westminster. He then sailed to Brisbane in 1934, leaving England in the March. In August 1934, Hugo became engaged to Lily Demeter. She was a glamorous Hungarian Hollywood star. Lily Demeter was born Lillian Carr in Paris and made more than 30 movies and stage musicals in the 1930s. She was one of the most successful female actors of the time when Talking Pictures first came out. Lily announced that they would be married in New York in the October. However, her acting contract with Samuel Goldwyn had a clause in it stating she could not fall in love before the contract ended. On the 31st of August 1934, in the Queensland Warwick Daily News, Lila Demeter, engagement to Rich Grazier, Hollywood chat. In Los Angeles, Hollywood hears that Lila Demeter is marrying a rich Australian sheep raiser, Mr. Hugo Brassey. Miss Demeter announced that Mr. Brassey will marry her in New York in October. Mr. Brassey is an Englishman, aged 38. Miss Demeter said that she first met him at a London house party in December, and he is at present in Queensland.
I was engaged in 1929 to Prince Louis Ferdinand, the ex-Crown Prince's son, and later to Mr. William Vanderbilt, the American millionaire's son, who was killed while motoring. I'm hoping the third engagement will prove happy. And in the Newcastle Sun, in September 1934, it shows a picture of them both in Paris. Mr. Hugo Brassey and Lily Demeter photographed in a Paris street. Mr. Brassey is at Talbragalba Station, Beaudesert District in Queensland. Miss Demeter says they've been engaged for 5 months, but had agreed to keep the news secret. Lily was in London making the stage musical Son of Guns and a movie called Brewster's Millions when the news broke. She was described as a provoking, dashing, mischievous little lady and starred with many of the big names like Cary Grant and Gary Cooper. And another article entitled Engagement of Hugh Brassey, engagements in inverted commas though. Lady Hor Ruthven is godmother. London, 30th of August, Miss Lily Demeter, film star, is not surprised at the report that Mr. Hugh Brassey has said that they are good friends but not engaged. Miss Demeter says that they've been engaged for 5 months but agreed to keep the news secret. I assume that Mr. Brassey did not want to give it away without consulting me, but I've just cabled telling him that it's leaked out here. From Brisbane, Mr. Brassey is called a dinkamozzie amongst station hands at Tabragalla and is very popular both at the station and in the town of Beaudesert. He is equally at home in the hall room or in carrying out the ordinary duties on the station. He's a splendid horseman and has taken part in camp drafting competitions in the district and reached the final in the bullock riding contest at the last Brisbane exhibition. Lila and I are very good friends, but as for an engagement, it has not been announced, is his attitude to the respected romance. Apparently Hugo grew impatient with the paparazzi's constant nagging and finally declared that the engagement was all news to me. Lily was not too devastated. She had no shortage of suitors and quickly moved on to become the first wife of 3 wives of the actor Errol Flynn in June 1935. Lily and Errol were married for almost 7 years before they divorced. They had a son, Sean, who was raised by Lily. Sean Flynn became a successful war correspondent covering the Vietnam War. He went missing in the Cambodian Khmer Rouge Civil War, and his remains were not found until after Lily's death. Lily married a second time and divorced again. Errol's career was over by 1941. His lifestyle took its toll, and he died early of liver disease and a heart attack in 1959 at the age of only 51. So after all that publicity, on the 22nd of February 1935 in the Brisbane Telegraph, by motor launched to England, Mr. Hugo Brassey's plans. Much interest has been aroused at Bribie Island at the visit of a motor launch which is being fitted up for a trip to England. It's a 9-tonne launch, 35 feet in length with an 11-foot beam. The boat was especially built at Maroochydore for Mr. Hugo Brassey. Navigation instruments and other accessories are being installed to ensure safety and comfort. After a brief stay at Bribie, Mr. Brassey will make a tour of the Barrier Reef. He'll then visit New Zealand and afterwards make the long voyage to England. He will probably travel via America, making a leisurely trip. He'll be accompanied by 1 or 2 friends and an able seaman. And then on the 10th of April 1935 in the Brisbane Telegraph, it was refreshing to find that Mrs. William Collins and beautiful Mrs. Joan Collins, who looked a picture in blue on the wharf yesterday as the Strathnaver drew out, others who waved farewell to the liner, which by the way had Hugo Brassey on board, were members of the Peirce family. On the 1st of July 1935 in the Sydney Labour Daily, plans a barrier tourist resort. Hugo Brassey, a godson of Lady Hor Ruthven, has released by cable from London plans for the conversion of Dunk Island, Great Barrier Reef, into a tourist resort by the erection of a log chalet and cabins. It is hoped to have everything ready for the next tourist season. Brassey hopes to leave for Australia via America within 4 weeks. So Hugo was back in England by the 27th of July 1935 and he married Dorothea Marguerite Ottoni Christa von Bodenhausen, known as Christa. The Baroness met Hugo merely 3 weeks before they married. And there was an article announcing his intention to wed. Mr. Hugo Brassey, who recently was in Queensland and who formerly was engaged to Lily Demeter, the film star, will marry Baroness von Bodenhausen, a kinswoman of Queen Mary, in a London registry office tomorrow. The Baroness is a lovely young German debutante and an ardent aviatrix. The couple intend a honeymoon in Australia and will travel to Sydney by the Monterey to stay with Sir Alexander Hor Ruthven, Governor of New South Wales, Afterwards, the couple will live at Dunk Island, of which Mr. Brassey has just secured a freehold and will spend 6 months of the year there. So yes, Krista was a baroness. She was from German aristocracy and she was a distant relation of England's Queen Mary. She was stunningly attractive, well-connected and highly energetic. She was well-educated, a trained pilot and spoke 5 languages fluently. Krista had been educated in England, France and Switzerland and spent her childhood living in her family's castle at Newborn near the Bavarian Alps, midway between Munich and Salzburg. So Hugo arrived at Bramo Bay in July 1935, around the time he got married, and the land was purchased for £10,000. His father bought it for them as a wedding present. After her whirlwind marriage to Hugo, Krista decided to drop the title and became plain Mrs. Brassey, and some of Hugo's friends called her Jack. They honeymooned on the RMS Berengia, sailing from France to New York. On that trip, he listed his occupation as an insurance broker. Lord and Lady Brassey had a large steam sailing yacht they named Sunbeam, and Hugo purchased it from them. He announced his intention to buy the yacht in March 1935 and was planning a visit to the Great Barrier Reef Islands. In the Queensland Illustrated Weekly in Brisbane on the 1st of August 1935, Hugo Brassey marries German Baroness to live on Dunk Island. Mr. Hugo Brassey, who was recently in Queensland, has married Baroness von Bodenhausen at the London Registry Office. The Baroness is a lovely young German debutante and an ardent aviatrix. "Just fancy," said the attractive young Baroness to the Queenslander representative, speaking in fascinating English, "I have not yet met a single Australian. What a thrill it would be to live in a hut on an island in mid-ocean. I have just become a pilot and I hope to do much flying in Australia." The Baroness, who was presented at court last March, came to England in 1927 from school. In explaining the excellence of her English, she said, "My greatest ambition was to marry an Englishman." Mr. Brassey says he intends to spend 6 months each year on Dunk Island, which he will use as a centre for big game fishing and crocodile, duck and geese shooting. He intends turning the house, which is at present on the island, into a restaurant, and will build several Mexican huts which visitors will use for rest or for fishing. He is about 26 years of age and first came to Australia in 1929 as the guest of Sir Alexander Hall Ruthven at Government House, Adelaide. Lady Hall Ruthven is his godmother. His grandfather and Lord Brassey, the former Governor of Victoria, were brothers. Krista adapted well to her new life and with great enthusiasm on Dunk Island. The couple travelled widely on their 68-foot yacht, the Sunbeam, and on their 37-foot motor launch, Twilight, as well as via regular public transport and ocean liners. They did not like the wet season, so they were in Sydney or Europe often and could be seen at Randwick and Ascot. A little bit of background on the purchase of the property. Spencer Hopkins had put a manager on the island and planned on building a small resort to aid the sale of the land, and he appointed Swiss restaurateur Frederick Truthart to set up a resort and manage it for him, but those ambitious plans did not eventuate. When Hugo's father purchased the land and the resort from Hopkins, Frederick and his wife, Enid Truthart, sued the Brasseys for wrongful dismissal in January 1936. Hugo had invited his cousin, Arthur Pollock, with his wife to do their job instead, and he gave the Trutharts no notice of their dismissal. Arthur had left Ireland in November 1935 for Dunk Island, so it was clear that this was planned. The Trutharts lost the case but were awarded £175 damages for the lack of notice given. That's $17,000 in today's money, yet after they paid the court costs awarded against them, they would almost certainly have been out of pocket. Hugo and Krista took on the resort with gusto, and at the peak of activity there were 52 people working in December 1935. Hugo had purchased the 2 large diesel generators used to power the town of Ballina in New South Wales. He planned to build 14 bungalows with septic tanks, and these were to accommodate 60 people at 10 shillings a day each, but the tender for sale said that there were only 5 chalets. They also built a dance hall, improved the water supply system markedly, built a substantial jetty, and renovated the Banfield bungalow. Almost a year after he purchased Dunk from Spencer Hopkins, the island's small resort opened in May 1936 with much fanfare and many notable visitors, including a vice-regal visit from the Governor-General and Lady Gowrie, of course, and a gaggle of reporters came on invitation. Hugo's sister Moira, with her English jockey husband John O'Brien, arrived at Dunk early on. The social pages loved that she was also way out there in their eyes, and arrived dressed in light blue flared slacks with a scarlet top and a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. Hugo was well known for bright clothes and had been cited in the gossip columns at different times for wearing bright red braces or sunbaking in the snappiest canary swimming trunks at Sydney's Lady Martin Beach. Hugo's father also came out to Dunk Island around this time, not long after his sister arrived with her husband. Overall, the commitment of the Brasseys to the resort business was quite weak. They feverishly built it and they loved the dream, yet running it had no appeal at all to them. It did open in mid-1936, but shortly after they left on a long cruise. But to make the resort a success, it needed their high-profile presence. In early October 1936, they took a trip on the Sunbeam to Timor, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia and Borneo. They planned to be away only 2 months, but Hugo flew on to London and he was pictured at Ascot in March 1937. He did return in June on business. Late in July 1937, the Governor-General and Lady Gowrie arrived at Dunk Island in the peak of tourism season, but the Brasseys were not there. They travelled in style on Australia's flagship cruiser, the HMAS Australia II. They were there for the celebrations of the opening of the resort's dance hall and brought their own orchestra for the event. The ship's company joined in with local dignitaries attending. However, Hugo and Krista were in London. Shortly after, in December 1937, Krista, still in London, petitioned for divorce after 2.5 years of marriage on the grounds of adultery. Artist Valerie Elberston, née Cohen, lived on nearby Tamana Island at the time with her sister, another well-known artist, Yvonne Cohen. And Valerie wrote an article for the Canberra Times in 1976 relating the story of their years on the islands during the war. She spoke fondly of Charlie, an old Aboriginal Malay man who was employed by Hugo as a resort gardener. His loyalty to Hugo never flagged, and he once said to Valerie, "He handsome fella, he good to me. I no care if he like him ladies too much." By January 1938, Hugo had given up on the resort and he'd sold the Twilight. In 1939, he built a small airfield which opened in the May, and Lady Gowrie came on an early flight. He continued building infrastructure to aid the sale, then left for the war in December 1939. When the RAAF annexed Dunk Island in 1942, those few people remaining to run the resort left the island. The resort was still owned by Hugo. As soon as the news of the war broke in 1939, Hugo joined the Royal Australian Naval Reserve and returned to England to serve in the Royal Navy. The island's only 4.5 kilometres from the mainland at Mission Beach. The tallest peak, Mount Kootaloo, 271 metres, was ideal for locating a strategic radar station. The island also had sufficient flat land to expand the handy emergency landing airfield that Hugo had built in 1939. Hugo left George Morris to run the resort until the RAAF and RAN arrived in 1942 and took control of the entire island. George and his wife stayed on Decatur for the RAAF radar teams. The US and Australian Naval Task Forces frequently use the area as well, mooring at the islands and conducting naval exercises and enjoying rest and recreation activities in the area. In the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, initially Hugo was a commander of a small trawler operating out of Scapa Flow, which was engaged in anti-submarine patrols. As a sub-lieutenant later, he was with the British force, vainly attempting to defend Norway in April 1940. 3 trawlers were sunk or badly damaged by German Heinkel bombers in Namsen Ford when attempting to evacuate French troops. And in the Courier Mail on the 11th of May 1940, Mr. Hugo Brassey rescued from sunken trawler. Sub-Lieutenants Prentice of Sydney and Brassey of Dunk Island, Queensland, both naval reservists, were amongst the survivors of the naval trawlers Gaul and St. Goran, sunk on the Norwegian coast. After being bombed and machine-gunned every few hours for several days off the Norwegian coast, the crews sheltered in the woods, but even there they were subjected to continual attacks from machine guns and bombs. And another article title says Lieutenant Hugo Brassey missed death by inches in Norwegian Ford battle. So Hugo was a junior officer on the HMT St. Goran. It was not directly hit by bombs, yet it was badly damaged and taking in water, and 5 sailors, including the captain, died on board before the crew took shelter among the rocks on the steep shore of the Ford. They returned to the boat at dusk but were warned of a German destroyer and 3 submarines approaching and decided to scuttle the boat rather than give it to the Germans. The crew were returned to Scapa on the HMS York after reading Namsos in Norway on a small fishing boat that rescued them. An Admiralty report in 1940 written by Lieutenant Alan Reid, replacement commander of the HMT St Goran, following the loss of the 3 anti-submarine trawlers in Norway, commended Hugo. I have pleasure in reporting that the entire ship's company behaved very well throughout the trying experience. Sub-Lieutenant Brassey was most resourceful in dealing with the wounded, and during our period in the hills, where he did much to keep the men in good spirits. I cannot speak too highly of him. Alan Reid, Lieutenant, RNVR, Glasgow, 8th of May 1940. It is said by some locals that Hugo became a submarine commander during the war and that he commanded one of the submarines that snuck in on the Tirpitz and sank it at its moorings. That sounded highly notable, yet a search of the war records, including the list of the commanders of all the subs involved in sinking the Tirpitz, showed that Hugo was not one of those sub-commanders. A press notice on the 19th of September 1940 recorded Hugo Brassey as being on the war wounded list. Hugo survived the war and reached the rank of lieutenant before returning for a short while to Dunk Island after the war. Hugo was in and out of Australia after the war, and he was mainly living in Ireland by then, living on his father's estate at Clonmel in Tipperary County in Ireland. He bred racing greyhounds for a while, but that was a token gesture. He mainly wanted to go fishing in Norway or jet set in bars and go to the races. All in all, he had no real career. He continued his close relationship with noted Badara Island artist Noel Wood, who stayed with him at the Brassey family estate at Clonmel in the early 50s. In 1948, Hugo married again, this time to an Irish-English girl, Barbara Frederica de Roll Peacock, known as Bubbles, of London. They met during the war, and when they married, Bubbles was 25. She'd had a major accident while driving an ambulance for the Royal Navy in London and had many months in hospital. Surgeons managed to reconstruct her face with extensive skin grafts, but they could not save one eye. In the Sydney Sun in November 1948, Honorary Hugo goes home for Christmas. The Honorary Hugo Brassey, 44, an old Etonian, owner of a mansion in Tipperary, an estate on Dunk Island, Queensland, and wearer of bright red braces, flew out of Sydney by Seapel today. Bubbles was heavily involved in horse racing and owned a few thoroughbreds. She came asunder in June 1954 when the jockey stewards ruled they weren't satisfied that Bubbles owned some of the horses that she raced, and she was banned from entering further races. After their marriage, they lived for a time at Dunas House in County Clare, but later returned to the family estate he inherited at Clonmel. In the Sun, Women's News says, in 1951, Hugo did not return to his Dunk home for winter because he was in plaster for an extended period with a back injury. Their daughter Sarah Ann Brassey was born on the 11th of March 1951 in Dublin, and she was named after Lady Sarah Peirce. She married Timothy Hewitt in September 1975 in Middlesex, England, and they had 2 children. Sarah died on the 1st of September 2015 at Witney, Oxfordshire, England, aged 64. So getting back to Dunk Island, the infrastructure investment was estimated at £20,000 and added to the cost of the land at £10,000. The sum invested by his father, Robert Brassey, was around £30,000. That's about $3 million in today's currency. On top of that, he purchased the Sunbeam and the Twilight and 4 motorboats. He advertised the land for sale initially at £80,000, but the newspapers expected a sale at £20,000 at the time. His father had not made a mint out of that investment. Hugo advertised the land for sale and eventually put it up for tender and sold all to Mr. E. C. Dopel of Ballarat in January 1952, so it took quite a long time to sell. They had a son, Thomas Noel Bingham Brassey, born on the 21st of April 1952 in Clonmel, and he was named after Lord Thomas Brassey. He married in April 1976 in Chelsea, London, when he was 24 to Carol Smith, and Thomas died on the 18th of February 2016 at the age of 63. Hugo did return to the island a few times with Bubbles up until 1954, when they attended the wedding of Brenda Jago in Tully. Hugo gave the bride away and helped officiate the event. Hugo died at the young age of 53, and summing up Hugo, it says, while he was born rich and lucky, he'd not achieved very much in his life. However, he probably enjoyed himself immensely, which matters most. He lived life to the fullest by all accounts, had fabulous romances and adventures. He was a social butterfly, a romantic adventurer and a popular playboy, and he certainly entertained. So I hope you enjoyed the interesting story of Hugo Brassey.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.